to study the problems of flight at transonic and supersonic speeds. Of the three, this is the best known, because on October 14, 1947, Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, a test pilot with the United States Air Force, flew it faster than the speed of sound. The flight demolished the myth of a sound barrier and opened the way for supersonic flight. This is the story of the Bell X-1 and the long and difficult quest to fly faster than the speed of sound. In World War II, piston-engined airplanes reached almost their full potential. As they moved closer to the speed of sound, the efficiency of propellers dropped off. A new source of power was sought, and experiments were carried out with a variety of jet and rocket power systems. Another problem emerged. It was called compressibility. Approaching the speed of sound, air molecules compress and form what at the time appeared to be a wall in front of an airplane. In March 1945, the Bell Aircraft Corporation was awarded a contract to develop 3 airplanes to research this problem. They would need to withstand great stresses.
Military fighters are designed to 9G. This airplane, all commercial airplanes, are designed to 4G, structural integrity. So the decision was made to double it for the X-1 and build it to 18G. It was practically, well, it was indestructible in flight. You couldn't do a maneuver that would tear the airplane up.
Compressibility couldn't be studied in the conventional wind tunnels of the time. In 1939, engineer Ezra Kocher suggested that the Army Air Corps develop an aircraft to study the problems of transonic and supersonic flight. His idea was revived in 1944 when fighters like the P-38 and P-47 began to experience compressibility problems in high-speed dives. Kocher and a team at Wright Field came up with a design which Kocher presented to the Army Air Corps and the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. Robert Woods, a Bell aircraft design engineer, convinced his company to become involved. In March 1945, Bell was awarded a contract to build 3 experimental aircraft. The fuselage design they adopted was influenced by the shape of a .50 caliber bullet, which was known to be stable at supersonic speed. The aircraft were to be rocket-powered. In the late 1930s, rocket engineer James Wild developed a small and highly efficient rocket motor using liquid propellants. With 3 friends who were also interested in rockets, he formed a company called Reaction Motors Incorporated to exploit it. Early in World War II, the United States Navy began experiments at Annapolis, Maryland, using rockets to assist the takeoff of heavily loaded Catalina flying boats. Reaction Motors negotiated a contract with the Navy, and James Wild's little rocket was developed as a JATO, or Jet-Assisted Takeoff Unit, and was successfully tested on a Martin Mariner flying boat. Like NACA and the Army Air Force, the Navy was interested in building an airplane that could exceed the speed of sound. It began work on a project called the D-558 and needed a rocket engine.
They decided to put what was essentially 4 of these JATO units together, wrap a lot of string around them, and supply them from a pump. It took a long time to do. During that time, the Air Force decided they would get the jump on the Navy and produce a supersonic airplane before the D-558. The rocket motor end of it, the assembly of 4, was already being fired for the Navy. And so they made what we call a pressure-fed version, in which you just use compressed gas to blow the propellants out of the tank and into the combustion chambers. And that became the engine for the X-1.
The engine was called the XLR-11. It needed development before it was ready to operate under flight conditions. When the first X-1, serial number 6062, rolled out of Bell's plant at Wheatfield, New York in December 1945, the reaction motor's XLR-11 engine was not yet in a condition to be installed. The decision to use rocket power for the X-1 meant the airplane couldn't be ground launched without wasting fuel that should be used in high-speed test flight. Instead, it would be dropped at altitude from a specially adapted B-29 bomber. A loading pit was designed so that the B-29 could be towed into position over the X-1. The X-1 was then attached to the B-29's bomb shackles and hoisted up under the fuselage, ready for launching at altitude. The first X-1 was taken to Pine Castle Air Force Base in Florida for a series of glide tests. Because the XLR-11 rocket engine wasn't ready, ballast was fitted into the X-1 to compensate. The job of piloting the X-1 in these initial glide flights belonged to Bell's flamboyant chief test pilot, Jack Willems, who had been flying with Bell since 1941. Delays with the delivery of the XLR-11 engine caused political pressure to mount. The glide flights out of Pine Castle Air Force Base were important to get the program underway and collect some initial data. On January 19, 1946, the X-1 number 1 was ready for its first glide test. The B-29 took off from Pine Castle Air Force Base with the X-1 shackled to its belly. The glide flights usually began from an altitude of 25,000 feet. Jack Willems reported that the dropping characteristics were ideal. Through February and into March, Willems flew another 9 glide tests out of Pine Castle. Extreme slow-motion film was taken to study the drop characteristics in detail. On March 6, Willems made the 10th glide flight. It was his last in the X-1. He was killed in a high-performance Bell P-39 just before the 1946 Thompson Trophy race. In the meantime, the second X-1 was completed. Larry Bell showed it off to the Air Force with the XLR-11 installed. It was to be taken to Muroc Dry Lake in California to begin the powered test program, while the number 1 plane came back to the Bell plant for modification. With the death of Jack Willems, the job of chief test pilot went to Tex Johnston on the left. Dick Frost was X-1 crew chief, and Bob Stanley on the right was Bell's chief engineer. This is Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert north of Los Angeles. Today it is the Center for Air Force Test Flight Operations, a highly developed facility with a long and distinguished flight test record. The facility here began to be developed in the early 1940s. Then it was called Muroc after Muroc Dry Lake. The X-1 number 2 arrived at Muroc on October 7, 1946, carried under the B-29. The X-1 was to be flown by Chalmers Goodland, Bell's new chief experimental test pilot. This is the X-1 loading pit at the South Base at Edwards as it looks today. In the early post-war years, experimental programs like the X-1 attracted a group of talented young men to Muroc.
All of the best wanted to be here because it was here that they could kind of pit their skills against their peers. And every one of these guys was very competitive in one way or another.
The airplanes were outstanding as far as the different kinds that you flew. The people were outstanding. That's one of the things I remember most, is they were dedicated, competitive.
The flying required rigid discipline. You had to fly a profile exactly, or as close to that as you could, the way it had been planned, because the purpose of the flight was to collect data. And if you freelanced or if you screwed up in some way, the data would probably be no good.
In this atmosphere of competition and discipline, relaxation was a necessity. An establishment close to the base called the Happy Bottom Riding Club, belonging to distinguished aviatrix and extraordinary character Pancho Barnes, became a focal point for off-duty activity at Muroc. In the 1930s, Pancho made a name for herself in air races. She was the ideal person to provide entertainment for test pilots.
Pancho was perhaps one of the most profane people who ever lived in terms of her vocabulary. She seemed to fit right in with these rowdy airmen, and there was just kind of an incredible affinity between them. Pancho's place gained notoriety really less for its equestrian activities than for the much-rumored escapades of the young ladies that Pancho hired to serve as hostesses. Pancho's is a part of the good old days around this place. This is where these guys went to celebrate their victories, sometimes to mourn their losses. Pancho was their friend. She helped a lot of people out when they were in trouble. If they needed money, if they needed a meal, they needed a place to stay. And it was at Pancho's where these guys could party, just have a good time.
Well, I think everybody that was there experienced Pancho Barnes. Yes, that was a good place to get a good steak.
Chalmers Goodland was known universally by his nickname Slick. He flew Spitfires for the Royal Air Force in the war and was a U.S. Navy pilot before joining Bell. Before the program of powered flights began, Goodland had a series of glide flights to become familiar with the handling characteristics of the X-1. The B-29 carrying the X-1 would climb to 25,000 feet. Before it reached the drop altitude, the X-1 pilot had to climb down in the blast of the slipstream through the B-29's open belly and slide into the X-1 cockpit. Once the pilot was comfortably seated, a B-29 crew member placed the X-1's cockpit door in position. The X-1 pilot then locked it from the inside. The X-1 launch was controlled from inside the B-29. As the X-1 dropped away from the B-29, it would be joined by a P-80 chase plane. The chase would observe the flight of the X-1 flying close beside it until it was safely back on the Muroc lake bed. While Slick Goodland completed 4 glide flights in the number 2 plane at Muroc, X-1 number 1 was back at the Bell plant having a thinner wing fitted. By the time it was delivered to Muroc on April 5, 1947, Goodland had carried out 12 powered flights on the number 2 plane, reaching a maximum speed of Mach 0.8, or 0.8 the speed of sound, in January 1947. At this stage, the program was going well. After an initial problem in December, when the B-29 was forced to land, still carrying the X-1 and its load of volatile fuel, the flights had been straightforward, and Goodland reported that the airplane possessed perfect control. The number 1 plane, with its new thin wing and modified tail, promised better performance than X-1 number 2. There was even some horseplay on the tarmac at Muroc. The reaction motor's XLR-11 rocket engine was fueled with liquid oxygen and a water-alcohol mixture. Fuel was fed into the combustion chamber by pressure from nitrogen gas, which also provided cockpit pressurization for high-altitude flight. Although the clean lines of the X-1's fuselage made it look simple, under the skin it was a highly complex machine with the pressurized cockpit, the rocket engine, 2 propellant tanks, 12 nitrogen spheres, 3 pressure regulators, and more than 500 pounds of flight test instrumentation. On April 10, 1947, Slick Goodland made one glide flight in the #1 airplane 6062 before beginning a program of powered flights. It was successful, and the following day 6062 was prepared for its first flight under the power of the reaction motor's XLR-11 rocket engine. It was now 14 months since the same airplane was dropped over Florida with Jack Willems at the controls for its first glide flight. All the X-1 flights were monitored from the ground by what was then a sophisticated telemetry system. On its first powered flight, 6062 was dropped from an altitude of 20,000 feet. Slick Goodland took it out to a speed of Mach 0.77. Under the terms of its contract, the Bell Company was required to test both airplanes to Mach 0.8. In the month from late April, Goodland made 6 more powered flights, but the speed he reached on the first flight wasn't improved on. There was talk of demands for large amounts of bonus money for flying the X-1 at higher speeds. Flight test reports from Slick Goodland indicated no problem with the airplane, but the program didn't appear to be progressing. Tex Johnston was back at the Bell headquarters in Buffalo. He heard some disturbing news.
The military wasn't real happy with the data that we're getting, and so I was chief pilot there, of course, at that point for Bell Aircraft, and so I went to Muroc and flew the airplane.
Although he hadn't flown the X-1, Tex Johnston knew it well in theory, having been involved in consultation on the cockpit layout. On April 22, 1947, he climbed into the X-1 and prepared for launch.
I was flying at 0.72, 7,200 is the speed of sound at that, which was fast in those days. But and the airplane was just gorgeous. You could wrap it up and fly it. The only problem was the trim, and the trim was too sensitive. You just barely touch it and it would over trim. Either way, it was unusable at really high speed. So you only have a few minutes of fuel, you know, and so by that time I'm out of fuel, and so I came in and landed and grounded the airplane for modification of the trim system and relocation of the control to the switch so you can run it with your thumb.
At the time, Captain Charles Yeager was a young fighter pilot not long out of test pilot training.
There was a hassle, not between Bell and the Air Force, but between the Bell test pilot and the Bell company on contract and bonus money and how it was to be paid. And the Air Force, since they were footing the whole bill, sat back and sort of watched this thing, you know, being drawn out. And then they noticed also being delayed, and we wanted to get on with the program.
Although Bell was a manufacturing contractor, the X-1 program was controlled by the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, and the Army Air Force.
I think at that time, NACA did not want the military to get involved in research flying. You know, the military's job is to fight wars. Well, the Air Force, when they saw this marvelous opportunity to latch onto the X-1, it opened up the whole future to us in research flying. And I think Colonel Boyd saw that.
Colonel Al Boyd was chief of flight testing.
He was an old-fashioned soldier. He imposed rigid discipline. He was a very strict disciplinarian, and nobody, believe me, nobody tried to lock horns with Al Boyd.
Boyd was a fine administrator and an accomplished pilot. He was well equipped to select the Army Air Force test pilot for the X-1. This is the Edwards Air Force Base control tower today. It's the hub of flight operations on a base that has seen 50 years of advanced flight testing. In 1947, Colonel Al Boyd made a decision that had great influence on shaping the evolution of the Air Force Test Flight Center.
Boyd did a masterful job of selecting. I know at one time, prior to going out there, he asked me who I thought should be the X-1 pilot. Of course, I said Captain Edwards, because Captain Edwards had a PhD in aeronautical engineering and was a pretty good stick and rudder guy too. He said, nah, if we put Edwards on it, he'll wind up being the test pilot and the test engineer. And if something should happen, you know, God forbid, we lose everything. Chuck is a pilot, Ridley is the test engineer. If something happens, we have somebody left.
Chuck was starting as a test pilot. He had a remarkable affinity for machines. He's not an engineer, but he has a great feeling for machinery. And in those days, you didn't have the telemetry and all the stuff you have now to record flights, so a lot of it depended on what the pilot could tell him when he landed. And he was quite good at explaining what had gone on in the flight and suggesting what might be the next step.
But when it got into some of the explanations as to why things were happening, then I'd have to consult Jack Ridley, because Jack had the ability to speak my language.
Chuck Yeager was a distinguished fighter pilot, but he was relatively new to flight testing. Boyd assembled a strong support team for him. Jack Ridley on the right was an engineer and pilot. Bob Hoover at left rear was also a backup pilot. Major Bob Cardenas was the B-29 pilot and senior officer.
I was in charge of the X-1 project. That doesn't mean I was Chuck's boss per se. Colonel Boyd was our boss of all of us. I was just the operations officer to make sure that the whole thing went.
Being a major who outranked me as a captain and Jack Ridley as a captain and Bob Hoover as a first lieutenant, when we came out to Muroc, he basically was the officer in charge. He obviously didn't fly the X-1. I was the primary pilot on the X-1, and my backup pilot was Lieutenant Bob Hoover. But the real brain in the team was Captain Jack Ridley.
Two members of the Bell Aircraft X-1 flight test crew joined the Army Air Force test team. They were Bell project engineer Dick Frost and crew chief Jack Russell. Yeager, Ridley, and Hoover were sent to Bell's facility at Buffalo to familiarize themselves with the X-1. But there was really only one person who had a body of experience flying the airplane. Yeager approached Slick Goodland for a test pilot's insight.
We had no one to talk to, and like I had a meeting with Slick Goodland and said, you know, what kind of technique you use for landing, what kind of speed you use for landing, and some of the pilot, talk. He was so ticked off that the Air Force had taken the program away from him. He said, well, if the Air Force wants to enter into a contract with me to check you out in the airplane, it'll cost a few $1,000. And as I recall, I looked down and said, I figure if you can fly it, I can fly it, and that was the end of that.
On August 6, 1947, Chuck Yeager was dropped in the X-1 for the first time. It was a glide flight.
It was easy for me to discipline myself into research flying. And I just had a little better, probably, hand-eye coordination. I had better visual acuity than most pilots. And the one thing that gave me a big advantage, more than anything else, was the ability to understand machinery. I was trained as a young boy to work on engines and mechanical things by my father. And then I was trained as a maintenance type in the Air Force before I became a pilot. The X-1 was a very complex piece of machinery, and it was easy for me to understand it. The ability to fly an airplane, is sort of secondary. Anybody's got that if they're trained for it.
Yeager made 2 more glide flights in the X-1 in the next 2 days. He'd already set tongues wagging when he rolled the X-1 just after launch on the first flight, and on the third, he performed a 2-turn spin. The X-1 test program shifted into a completely new gear. The Army Air Force was about to change. In July 1947, President Truman signed a document that would bring an independent United States Air Force into existence on September 18th. NACA appointed their own test pilots for the X-1. Their test program in the number 2 airplane, 6063, was also planned to start in September. The Air Force team concentrated on X-1 number 1.
I did all the flying on the number 1 airplane, 6062, because we were interested in high speed, and you didn't have the drag on the real thin wings that you had on the thick wing that was on the number 2 airplane.
The fastest the Bell pilots had flown the X-1 was 0.8 the speed of sound. The Air Force's plan, in consultation with NACA, was to make a series of flights that began where Bell had left off and approach Mach 1 in small increments of speed. Chuck Yeager painted a name on the side of the X-1. He called it Glamorous Glennis, after his wife. He was ready to fly under power.
It was my job to see the B-29 was operating, normal, loaded, everything. But then I had to taxi it over to where they had dug a pit so the X-1 could fit down in the hole. And then they towed the B-29. I was in charge of that part until it came time to actually load the X-1 up into the B-29 and put it on the bomb racks. Then was a combination of Russell, the crew chief on the X-1, and my crew chief on the B-29, as well as Dick Frost. And of course, Chuck very interested in the whole thing too.
It's early morning at Muroc. The B-29 with 6062 slung tightly against its belly is taxied into position for fueling. 600 gallons of water-alcohol mixture and liquid oxygen are pumped aboard the X-1. It's a volatile combination. The P-80 chase planes are prepared for flight. Their role is critical to mission safety. Bob Cardenas prepares for the takeoff.
My only problem I faced was on takeoff, I could not lift the nose wheel of the airplane more than about 11 inches off the ground without scraping the tail of the X-1. And of course, if you scrape the tail of the X-1 with the volatile fuel you had on board, there might be a problem.
The process of dropping the X-1 was not always straightforward.
When you use a plain B-5 bomb shackle, it's designed for 2,000-pound bomb and hang some 14,000 pounds on it, and you have to have a safety system where you have a pin in it to keep from releasing inadvertently. And the human element, sometimes, a couple of times, we released the X-1, pulled the release handle without pulling the safety pin out, and that bound it up. And all in all, it was an amusing thing every once in a while when you're sitting in the X-1. So it's, what in the Christ is going on up there,
If the X-1 wouldn't release, its fuel had to be jettisoned.
We dumped as much of the fuel as we could, that is the X1, overboard, but I still had to land with it connected. Chuck stayed in it. He didn't trust anybody. He was going to make damn sure that if it did release inadvertently, at least he'd be in it to fly it away. Of course, when it got down to, I forget how high we were, but when it got down low enough where he figured he wouldn't have a chance to fly it anyway, he crawled back out, came up on board.
Chuck Yeager made his first powered flight on August 29, 1947.
Basically, the engine was really neat, and with rocket power. I'd never experienced it before. It's smooth, quiet, and when everything worked, it's beautiful. And same way with on the first powered flight, I took it up to about 0.85 Mach number, which is, 0.05 of a Mach number above what the Bell people had flown it.
Colonel Boyd wasn't impressed.
The airplane accelerated so fast, I went up to about 8.5 first. And when I came down and wrote up my report, he got a little stern with me. He said, why did you go above 8.2 Mach number? And I said, well, I was flying the airplane. It felt good. I saw nothing wrong with letting it accelerate out a little bit. But he said, just don't compromise safety. That was one thing he was very stern about.
Speed was gradually increased over a series of flights.
We'd run it on out to 0.92 Mach number and got into buffeting. It was pretty heavy buffeting. And then at 0.94 Mach number, we're sitting there in pretty heavy buffeting. I rolled the airplane over and to pull 3 Gs at 9.4 Mach number, and we had no control of the airplane. The elevators were totally useless. And what we did then, we just rolled it out and turned off the rockets and came down and said, man, we got a real problem, because it had been predicted the X-1 would either pitch up or down in the region of the speed of sound, and then we couldn't control it. If we couldn't control it in that region, we were in trouble.
The X-1's horizontal stabilizer assembly could be moved to adjust the trim of the airplane.
Now, we had never used this horizontal stabilizer in flight, because we just trimmed it out at 2 degrees nose down, left it there because that's where the airplane flew good. And that was where old Jack Ridley's brain came into effect. He said, after looking at a lot of the data, it showed that this shock wave, which had formed on the fixed part of the horizontal stabilizer, as we increased our Mach number, this shock wave moved back and sort of laying down. Well, at 9.4 Mach number, it was at the hinge point of the elevator, and we lost our elevator effectiveness. Well, Jack Ridley said, if let's try to fly the airplane with the horizontal stabilizer, and if you think you're good enough to do it, it may save your tail.
5 young kids out in the desert. We rolled it into the hangar. Jackie went down to Lancaster and got a worm gear, and we fixed the elevator neutral, modified the tail a little bit so that Chuck could actually work the whole tail, which later became known as the flying tail.
Then we went up and tried to fly the airplane with the horizontal stabilizer, and that when we found out that we could, that solved all of our problems.
It was a tremendously important breakthrough, one that had a swift and profound effect on the design of high-performance aircraft, first in the United States and later around the world. As the X-1 project approached the speed of sound, there was discussion with NACA experts and academics about the hazard of exceeding Mach 1.
We had 4 PhDs descended on Muroc. Mr. Soule, Dr. Soule was one of them from Ames Laboratory. I believe Dr. Perkins from Princeton and Caltech and MIT. Real power. Well, Jackie Ridley took them on in the old tar paper operations shack at the blackboard. Chuck and I sat there and listened to him. And for a long period of time, they were going at it. At the end, it was a draw. Jackie couldn't convince them that we could do it, and they couldn't convince Jackie that we were going to kill Chuck.
The Air Force's 9th powered flight was scheduled for October 14, 1947. The program was close to reaching Mach 1.
I really hadn't coordinated too much with John Boyd, but I thought I better let him know. So I called Boyd on the phone. I appraised him of the situation as it stood. And the old son of a gun, he didn't say do it, he didn't say don't do it, he just said, well, good luck, that's it. Which I interpreted as a go ahead.
In the rear cockpit, the RSO must keep the plane on the black line, the pre-planned route to the target. As they reach enemy territory, he concentrates on the radar and defensive systems, trying to jam enemy communications in the event of a missile launch.
We carried the same type of jammer that was used throughout the Vietnam War by all of the fighters and bombers, which attempted to jam the communication between the radar site and the missile itself. Once they began the communication, our indications in the cockpit would go from warning to jamming, and it would be jamming that communication link to the missile.
But sometimes the enemy would try to attack the SR-71 by launching a missile without any radar guidance.
We were coming in off the water, headed inland, and the pilot says, "Hey, Reg, look out your right window." And here is what looks like a telephone pole about 150 yards away that's going just straight up. He said, "Was that close enough?" And I said, "Yeah, that was close enough."
Our main defense, if we were fired upon, was increased speed. And we could increase 100 knots, 200 knots in just a matter of seconds, which is a lot of differential in speed for a missile to cope with.
Approaching the target area, the RSO concentrates on operating the high-tech surveillance equipment. The 6 different cameras were able to photograph 100,000 square miles in an hour, producing images with such high resolution that a vehicle's number plate could be clearly identified.
The surveying capability of the aircraft was fantastic because you're going in a straight line for 2,000 miles. You could look out as far as the horizon goes, and from horizon to horizon, that's what you could survey.
For the crews flying in the top 1% of the atmosphere, it gave them a unique perspective on the world.
The first thing that you notice that's phenomenal is the change of the sky color. At about 60,000 feet, the sky turns a deep indigo steel blue that is so mesmerizing. You just want to look at it. It's fascinating.
You know, if I flew the aircraft up near the Arctic Circle, and I might actually traverse dawn to dusk and back 2 or 3 times. I've seen the sun rise and set 3 times on a flight, which is very unusual. I mean, we're actually flying faster than the Earth's rotation, so we're outrunning the sun.
On landing, the highest priority is to download the cameras, known as sensors, as quickly as possible.
Everyone was deeply concerned that their sensor performed as it was designed to do and programmed to do. So there was a lot of serious concerns there, and there was a lot of happiness because the plane had made a successful mission and the crews were home.
The films were then rushed off for processing and analysis.
Well, the photo interpreters were a brilliant bunch of young airmen, and they could look at that film and they could spot something had been moved or a new facility was going up. They were great at that. And they would call their supervisors if they saw something of interest, you know, that needed to be flagged and brought to the attention of the intelligence people.
One of the things I enjoyed about flying the Blackbird was knowing that information is power. The information we would gather could very well preclude bombs having to be dropped at all. It could save a lot of people's lives by having the right information at the right time.
The Blackbird crews were successfully infiltrating enemy territory and gathering a massive intelligence about their adversaries. But with the Iron Curtain still firmly in place and Soviet technology constantly improving, how long would the SR-71 remain flying safely in such dangerous areas? In October 1973, they would face their most crucial test. In the early 1970s, the world's attention focused on the Middle East. Tension between America's ally Israel and her Arab neighbors was reaching breaking point. On the 6th of October 1973, Soviet-backed Egypt and Syria attacked Israel and made dramatic territorial gains. With the Middle East caught up in the politics of the Cold War, an Israeli defeat would bring with it the threat of nuclear conflict. The Soviets had launched their Cosmos 596 satellite, bringing them immediate intelligence from the battlefronts and putting them one step ahead of the United States. It was time to bring in the Blackbird. The SR-71 would fly directly from Griffiths Air Force Base, New York, to the Middle East. The flight would be over 11 hours long, with 6 refuelings. No Blackbird crew member had ever experienced such a lengthy, complex mission.
I flew a 10.5-hour training flight, and I was beat. By the time I got out of the airplane, I said, whew, that's about as far as I can fly. But when they said you can fly 11 hours and 20 minutes, you jump up and you say, yes, sir, you know, I'll be happy to do that.
I picked Jim Shelton as the first pilot to fly the mission. I knew he was an extremely reliable, highly qualified, and had done extremely well in all of his training and everything. So I had total confidence that if the mission could be done, that Jim would do it.
On the 12th of October, under codename Giant Reach, the mission began.
We took off from Rome, New York around 1 or 2 in the morning because you want to be over a target area somewhere between 11 and 1 o'clock. This allows you to have some shadows so the photo interpreters can go ahead and judge elevation, but yet get you the best sun position you can have.
By 10 o'clock in the morning, the SR-71 had reached its second refueling point over Portugal. Because of the highly classified nature of this mission, no one other than the tanker crew knew they were coming.
On the way into that particular refueling, the tanker crews said the Portuguese control kept calling out an airplane in relation to the tanker. And the tanker says, you know, we don't see anybody. Of course, they knew it was us, but I'm sure that they could tell on their scope something was happening because the 2 blips merged for a while, for 20 minutes, and then this one accelerates on.
Jim Shelton approached the Egyptian coastline. The Egyptians were well equipped, with their Soviet allies constantly replenishing their supplies.
Russia was developing the SA-5, which was a missile that would go up above, well above your altitude and come back down at you. And yes, that was a concern.
With 160 SAM missile sites, many secretly commanded by Soviets, and sophisticated radar tracking systems, they were on full-scale alert, watching the skies for any enemy infiltration.
As soon as we got into range of the Egyptian SAM sites, they started tracking us.
The Egyptians, alerted to an unidentified aircraft appearing on their radar systems and presuming the plane to be either Israeli or American, scrambled to launch their surface-to-air missiles. 80,000 feet above them, traveling at a speed of over Mach 3, Jim Shelton's Blackbird was gathering thousands of feet of film, capturing the extent and whereabouts of the Egyptian military forces.
You had the radar receiver in the back cockpit. Gary could tell me that, yes, now we're being tracked by some SAM missile. We need to do something. So at that particular point, we would jam, we would speed up.
By the time the Egyptian missiles were ready to fire, the the SR-71 had already cleared their airspace and was speeding towards Israel. But the heavily armed Israelis also had no knowledge of this covert Blackbird operation and immediately went on full alert.
When we rolled in on the first pass over Israel, my defensive system just lighted up like a pinball machine. And I indicated to my pilot, I got all these indications back here. I said, just, maybe keep your eyes open because it seems like somebody's shooting at us.
Despite launching a barrage of missiles, the Israelis did not manage to shoot their presumed enemy out of the sky. The Blackbird headed back to the United States.
We got everything we were tasked for, got the airplane back, and that's the first time airplane, the SR-71, had flown 11 hours and 20 minutes. After we land, the next couple of days, Gary and I get invited to the Pentagon. Admiral Moore, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, wanted to thank us for the work that we had done, and they showed us some photos.
The photographs were detailed enough to show how many Israeli tanks had been destroyed in the initial battles.
We were to go ahead and resupply the Israelis with some of their lost equipment. So the photo interpreters are counting the number of tanks that we would be replacing. So it was a very crucial point for the SR-71.
It was a very sensitive mission, and there was a lot of pressure to get that first one done. Jim and his backseater nailed them. He got all the targets, and everyone was absolutely elated.
8 more successful Blackbird missions supplied detailed intelligence that the war was now turning in Israel's favor. With this information, the United States was able to broker an eventual ceasefire on the 24th of October.
I think the SR-71 contributed greatly to the resolution of that war. No one knew the airplane could fly that far and perform a mission like that and come back and hand the intelligence people the product.
The Blackbird was also a record breaker. On September the 13th, 1974, Kelly Johnson's SR-71 flew across 7 time zones from London to Los Angeles in a race with the sun, taking just 3 hours, 47 minutes, and 39 seconds.
For the record-breaking flight, I was over at the FAA Control Center, and the controller is a huge screen, and he said, here's a 747 coming out of Phoenix. And it'd go blip. Blip. It moved about ½ inch or ¼ inch. He said, okay, get ready. Here comes the SR-71 out of Canada. And it goes, brrrt, and there goes my antenna, brrrt, there goes Idaho. and get ready, boom! And it almost blew us out of the way because he was right overhead. And he was starting to decel, but he managed to blow the windows out of Zsa Gabor's house in the Hollywood Hills.
In the same year, the Blackbird had flown a record-breaking flight from New York to London. 52 years earlier, Charles Lindbergh had flown approximately the same distance in 33 hours. The SR-71 made the flight in 1 hour, 55 minutes, and 42 seconds. But the SR-71 would soon be needed in a more serious capacity. Another Soviet-backed Middle Eastern enemy was on the warpath and was determined to humiliate the United States. There would be no better way than to shoot the SR-71 out of the sky. Tension between the United States and much of the Arab world continued. In 1972, the revolutionary leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, announced that he was giving aid to terrorist organizations in Europe and the Middle East. He issued repeated threats to America and indicated that those who crossed the Gulf of Sidra would be crossing a line of death. By the spring of 1986, worldwide terrorism had reached unprecedented levels. President Reagan's patience was wearing thin.
Gaddafi deserves to be treated as a pariah in the world community. We call on our friends in Western Europe and elsewhere to join with us in isolating him. If these steps do not end Gaddafi's terrorism, I promise you that further steps will be taken.
Then, on the 5th of April 1986, a bomb exploded in a West Berlin disco. Among the 232 casualties, 2 American servicemen were killed. The United States found clear evidence that Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi was behind the attack. At RAF Mildenhall in England, SR-71 pilot Brian Shule knew that they were on course for retaliation.
Now, we knew that something was going on because all of a sudden the Mildenhall base had an extra security arm of guards around it. Our BOQ living quarters had armed guards at the doors. The next thing you knew, every tanker in the Air Force practically was landing at Mildenhall. There were new airplanes on the ramp that you hadn't seen before. And it was no secret to every Brit aircraft spotter out there that there was something going on.
The British government would allow the United States to fly the missions from their bases in England. At 9:30 a.m. on the 14th of April, the SR-71 crew members were ordered to a top-secret briefing. They were informed that the 48th Tactical Fighter Wing at Lakenheath would be striking selected Libyan targets within hours.
When we heard the words, this morning at 2 a.m., the F-111s are launching, we were a little surprised that, well, this is for real, it's happening.
The SR-71's job would be to record the results of the airstrikes against Tripoli and Benghazi. That night, the F-111s began their mission.
So when we're trying to sleep, in the middle of the night, you're awakened by the roar of F-111s taking off. Listening to that, it was quite serious at that time because we knew maybe some of those people wouldn't come back.
By the time the SR-71 crews arrived to prepare for their mission, the F-111s were already bombing Libya.
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this evening, Eastern Time, air and naval forces of the United States launched a series of strikes against the headquarters, terrorist facilities, and military assets that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities. Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again.
The 111s had a number of targets to take out missile defenses, sites and things, but also all the terrorist training camps, and to really hit Gaddafi's headquarters, basically, to really show him that we're going to come right into his backyard. Our job was to come and assess everything that was done, gather pictures and target data for maybe succeeding strikes.
Flying in directly after a bombing raid, the crews could expect Libya's sophisticated air defense network to be on full alert and eager to retaliate.
We were subsonic off Land's End, getting ready to get to the tanker, and we saw the string of F-111s coming back. And my backseater, Walter, was counting the planes as they came back and passed us. And he came up one short. And he knew that somebody had not made it home, and we were very sad in the cockpit at that time before we even started that we had lost an entire crew. But yet, it gave us more resolve.
After refueling and now traveling at supersonic speeds, they neared the Gulf of Sidra and the Libyan target area.
We're doing over 2,000 miles an hour at this point, and we were like a speeding bullet, except faster. And we had crossed the line of death with impunity.
But the Libyans, equipped with the latest Soviet long-range high-altitude missiles, posed the greatest threat yet to the Blackbird.
It was at that time that Walter started picking up some missile signals. He got 2 indications and then actually got a launch indication. And we had a big decision to make where we were running into the target area before we made the turn. Do we continue to that point where Gaddafi's headquarters were, or do we make a turn away now to save ourselves from the missiles? And our decision was to push the throttles forward. And we thought in 14 seconds we can beat that missile to that point and then make the turn. Made the turn, went feet wet, got to the coast, and I will tell you, that was probably the fastest I've ever seen the SR-71 fly.
They'd outrun the missile, gathered the photographic intelligence, and were now heading away from the danger zone.
Walt said, okay, you can pull it back now. My hand was still locked in the forward position there. We were seeing Mach numbers that were a little scary, that we had not seen before, and the jet did it effortlessly.
The intelligence photos that were brought back clearly showed that the bombing mission had been a success. It was decided there would be no need to risk more American airmen's lives over Libya with further bombing.
We brought back the confirmation of to whether we needed to go in again or not, what we had really done, where their defenses were, what they really had. But we made a statement to Gaddafi, and if you'll notice, you remember, you didn't hear a lot from him for a long time after that.
But despite the success of the SR-71s over Libya, its days were numbered. At the end of the 1980s, it was decided that the cost of operating the SR-71 was no longer sustainable. The Blackbird program was terminated. From now on, all American surveillance would be carried out by satellites.
The reason that was given was that it was too expensive. Well, it's reconnaissance. That's sometimes that can be very expensive. And if you don't have reconnaissance, you're pretty blinded. And now they like to say that the satellites can do it all. And satellites can do a great deal, and they're magnificent capabilities. But there are things they can't do, and there are things that are unique that only the SR-71 can do.
On December the 20th, 1989, the SR-71 made a final pass down the runway at Lockheed's Burbank plant in honor of all those who worked on this exceptional plane. Kelly Johnson was there to pay an emotional farewell to his favorite creation.
You can't say enough about Kelly Johnson himself. You know, he was an absolute aeronautical genius. Working for Lockheed, I think he's made the greatest aircraft that ever existed. There's just something about the sleek SR-71 that makes it in a class of one. There is no other.
Impressive to the last, the Blackbird set 4 international speed records while being delivered to the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum.
People love a winner. They love when someone is the best in their field. This aircraft was the best in its field. It was the prime speed machine of the world. Every speed and altitude record that it set, it holds to this day.
The SR-71 Blackbird served 6 different presidents and saw action on hot and cold war fronts alike. And despite being shot at over 4,000 times, no aircraft was ever lost to enemy fire.
It is the only operational airplane in the history of the American Air Force in which no Air Force crew members were ever killed. That's a record that no other airplane has. And when you consider the environment in which it flew, the speed, the altitude, the temperatures, that's a real credit to Kelly Johnson.